Imagine this: a king with an iron will, ruling a land forever changed by his arrival. But instead of lifting a sword, he picks up a quill. In the year 1086, William, known as the Conqueror, did something remarkable. He set out to write a book that would decide the fate of thousands, maybe even millions across England. People called it the Domesday Book. To some, it felt like the end of the world. To others, it was just another royal order, another reason to worry about what tomorrow would bring. Now let me ask you, what matters more to you? The earth you work with your own hands, or your name, written by a stranger, forever sealed in a book you may never see? If you love history, and you're curious about the secrets hidden behind the rise and fall of great empires, stick with us. Like this video, subscribe to the Medieval Archives, and join us as we explore stories that often hide between the lines of dusty old documents. Let's go back to that moment. More than 9 centuries ago, William was not just a conqueror. He was a man facing a deeply uncertain kingdom. The echoes of the Battle of Hastings still lingered. Rebels whispered in the fields, uncertain of their place in this new world. In every village, people wondered what the future would hold. Would their lives change for the better, or would their names vanish like mist? It was during this uneasy time that William made his move. He sent out his men, not with weapons, but with questions. They knocked on doors, walked into barns, watched the harvest, and asked about every last pig, every strip of land, every single person who called England home. Can you picture it? A Norman scribe dressed in a heavy cloak, arriving in a small village at dawn. The villagers gathered, anxious as he began to write down everything they owned. Nothing was too small to record. Even fields left empty, the so-called wasteland, found a place in this giant ledger. And here's something curious. Many believed that once your name was written in the Domesday Book, it could never be erased. Some even compared it to the Day of Judgment, when every soul would be accounted for. This book was not just about land or cattle. It was about power. It was about knowing with certainty who belonged where and who owed what. For William, it meant control. For the people, it meant living with the knowledge that their lives were now measured in ink and parchment, not just in sweat and soil. So, as we follow the story of the Domesday Book, remember this: history is not just about battles and kings. It is also about the quiet moments, the questions asked in candlelit rooms, the choices people had to make, and the names that still echo through time. Ready to turn the page? Let's find out what happened next. Picture this. It's been 20 long years since that fateful day at Hastings in 1066, when William's Norman cavalry shattered the Anglo-Saxon shield wall and changed England forever. But here's what most people don't realize. Winning the battle was just the beginning of William's problems. By 1086, the Conqueror was facing his darkest hour. Imagine ruling a country where most of your subjects still saw you as nothing more than a foreign invader. Every morning, William would wake up in his stone castle, knowing that somewhere out there in the misty English countryside, Saxon nobles were whispering plans of rebellion around their hearths. These weren't just idle threats. They were real conspiracies brewing in manor houses and hidden valleys across the land. Meanwhile, his own Norman lords were living like kings in castles that had once belonged to Saxon families. They'd drink wine from goblets that weren't rightfully theirs, sleep in beds warmed by fires built from timber, cut by hands that had once sworn loyalty to Harold Godwinson. Can you imagine the tension in the air? The constant fear that one morning, the peasants working your fields might decide they'd had enough of Norman rule. But here's where William's story gets really fascinating. He claimed, and perhaps even believed, that the Domesday Book was about divine justice. Picture him in his private chambers, surrounded by flickering candlelight, telling his advisors that God himself had commanded this great survey. "We must know what belongs to whom," he'd say, "so that justice can be served in the eyes of the Almighty." Yet anyone watching William's eyes when he spoke of the survey would see something else entirely. The gleam of a man who understood that knowledge was power, and power meant gold flowing into his treasury. Every manor house recorded meant taxes collected. Every field cataloged meant revenue secured. This wasn't just about divine justice. This was about survival in a hostile land. And then there's a moment that captures the human drama of this entire period. Picture an old Saxon peasant, let's call him Aldrich, working his small plot of land that his family had farmed for generations. He's heard the rumors. Norman officials are coming to count everything, to record every soul, every animal, every grain of wheat. When the royal commissioners arrive in his village, accompanied by armed Norman knights whose mail shirts catch the morning light, Aldrich makes a desperate choice. He hides his youngest son in the root cellar beneath his cottage. You see, he's heard whispers that boys of fighting age might be taken, or that families with more sons might face higher taxes. So there's this heartbreaking scene. A father pressing his finger to his lips, telling his boy to stay silent no matter what sounds he hears above. The irony is almost too much to bear. Here was William, claiming to bring order and justice to England, while ordinary people like Aldrich were literally hiding their children from his representatives. It shows us that even the most well-intentioned policies, if that's what the Domesday Book truly was, can feel like tyranny to those who never asked to be ruled by foreign kings. This wasn't just about counting sheep and measuring fields. This was about power, fear, survival, and the crushing weight of conquest on ordinary human lives. And that's what makes the story of the Domesday Book so much more than just medieval bureaucracy. It's the story of how empires are really built, one terrified family at a time. Close your eyes and imagine the sound that would have struck fear into every English village in 1086. The deep, mournful tolling of church bells announcing the arrival of the king's commissioners. But these weren't church bells celebrating a feast day or calling people to prayer. These were warning bells because everyone knew what was coming. Picture the scene. In monasteries across England, monks bent over their writing desks by the warm glow of beeswax candles, their quill pens scratching endlessly across parchment. These weren't just any monks. They were the most skilled scribes in the kingdom, hand-picked for their ability to write quickly and accurately. The irony is beautiful and tragic at the same time. Here were men of God, devoted to peace and prayer, helping to create what many villagers saw as an instrument of oppression. The commissioners themselves were an intimidating sight. Imagine a small army of royal clerks, each one flanked by Norman knights in full armor, their swords catching the light as they rode into villages that had never seen so much military force in one place. The sound of hoofbeats on muddy roads, the clink of mail armor, the creak of leather saddles. These sounds announced that your quiet village life was about to be turned upside down. But here's where the story gets really human and complex. Among these commissioners was a man named Richard de Clare, not just any Norman lord, but someone wrestling with his own conscience. Picture Richard sitting in his tent at night after a long day of interrogations, staring at the flame of his oil lamp, and wondering if what they were doing was truly just. Richard had fought alongside William at Hastings. He'd earned his lands through blood and loyalty. But now, watching terrified English peasants being forced to account for every pig, every chicken, every handful of grain they owned, he was beginning to question whether this was the kind of kingdom he'd fought to create. During the day, Richard would maintain his stern Norman composure. He'd sit beside the royal scribes as they fired questions at trembling villagers. How many oxen do you own? How much land can you plow in a day? What taxes did you pay to your Saxon lord before the conquest? But at night, alone with his thoughts, Richard would remember the faces of children clinging to their mother's skirts, too frightened to speak. The most heartbreaking part was how thorough this process had to be. Imagine being a poor farmer who'd never owned anything more valuable than a few pigs and some chickens, suddenly being interrogated as if you were hiding great treasures. The commissioners weren't just asking about major holdings. They wanted to know about every single animal, down to the last goose waddling around your yard. And here's a detail that shows how terrifying this process really was. Peasants genuinely believed that lying to the king's men was not just a crime against the crown, but a sin that would condemn their souls to eternal punishment. The threat of execution was real enough, but for deeply religious medieval people, the fear of divine judgment was even more powerful. Picture a scene that probably played out in hundreds of villages. A farmer named Edmund standing before the commissioners, his hands shaking as he tries to remember exactly how many pigs he owns. Is it 7 or 8? Did that sow have piglets this spring? Or was that last year? One wrong number could be seen as an attempt to hide assets from the king. The stakes couldn't have been higher for people who owned almost nothing to begin with. Richard de Clare would have witnessed these moments of pure human terror, and each one would have chipped away at his certainty that this great survey was truly just. But here's the tragedy of his position. He was trapped by his own loyalty. To speak against the Domesday survey would be to question William's judgment, and for a Norman lord, that was unthinkable. So Richard kept his doubts to himself, another silent witness to the human cost of building an empire. This wasn't just medieval bureaucracy in action. This was the moment when ordinary people realized that their new Norman rulers intended to know everything, control everything, and own everything. And that realization changed England forever. Now here's where the story takes a chilling turn that most history books won't tell you. What if I told you that the Domesday Book wasn't just about counting sheep and measuring fields? What if this massive survey had a much darker purpose hidden beneath its official mission? Picture this. Months into the Great Survey, whispers began spreading through English villages like wildfire. People started noticing something terrifying about the way certain names were being recorded. Some entries appeared in the usual brown ink that monks used for their daily work. But other names, specific names, were being marked with a different color entirely. A color that made people's blood run cold when they glimpsed it on the parchment. Red ink. Now, you have to understand what red meant in medieval times. It wasn't just another color for scribes to use. Red ink was reserved for the most important, most dangerous information. When monks copied religious texts, they used red ink for the words of Christ himself. When royal clerks wrote official documents, red ink marked the most serious crimes and punishments. So imagine being a village leader, watching nervously as the royal scribes worked at their tables, and suddenly seeing them dip their quills into that crimson ink pot. Your heart would stop, because everyone knew what red ink meant in royal documents. It meant someone was marked for death. The terrifying reality was slowly becoming clear. The Domesday Book wasn't just recording who owned what. It was creating a master list of potential threats to Norman rule. Every Saxon lord who'd shown even a hint of resistance, every village leader who'd been slow to submit, every landowner who still commanded loyalty from local people, their names were going into the book in red ink. Picture the scene in some remote monastery where monks were copying these records. Brother Thomas, let's call him, would be working by candlelight, carefully transcribing the information brought by the royal commissioners. Most of the time, he'd use his regular brown ink, methodically recording acres of land and numbers of livestock. But then would come a name that made him pause, perhaps someone he'd heard whispered about in the corridors, someone the Norman lords considered dangerous. Thomas would set down his brown quill and reach for the red ink pot with trembling fingers. As he wrote that name in crimson letters, he'd know he wasn't just recording information. He was quite possibly writing someone's death sentence. Here's something that will absolutely blow your mind. The very name Domesday Book comes from a moment of pure medieval terror. The name wasn't chosen by William or his officials. It came from ordinary English people who were so frightened by this survey that they compared it to the Day of Judgment described in the Bible. Picture this. There was a monk, probably working in some drafty scriptorium, who looked at the massive scope of this survey and was struck by a chilling comparison. Just like the biblical Day of Judgment, when every human soul would be called to account for their deeds before God, this book was calling every English person to account for their possessions before their Norman king. Nothing could be hidden, nothing could be forgotten, and for some, the judgment would mean eternal punishment. The monk who first called it the Domesday Book probably never imagined that his terrified comparison would become the official name that would echo through history for nearly 1,000 years. Think about this for a moment. Would you have had the courage to lie to William the Conqueror's commissioners, knowing that your name might end up written in red ink? Imagine standing before those Norman officials, your heart pounding, knowing that one wrong answer might not just cost you your property, but your life. The psychological warfare was brilliant and terrifying. William didn't just want to know what England contained. He wanted every English person to know that he knew. He wanted them to understand that nowhere was safe from his reach, that no secret could be kept from his administrators, and that resistance was not just futile, but potentially fatal. This wasn't just medieval record-keeping. This was the moment when surveillance became a tool of absolute power, and when a simple book became more feared than any army that had ever marched across English soil. If you're enjoying the video, subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel, like it, and comment. Would you dare lie to William? Here's a statistic that will make your jaw drop. Imagine if just 7 people out of every 100 in your country suddenly controlled half of everything. Half the land, half the wealth, half the power. That's exactly what happened in England after the Norman Conquest. The Normans, who made up barely 7% of the population, had seized control of 50% of all English land within just 20 years. Think about what that really means. Picture your neighborhood, your town, your entire region. Now imagine that 19 out of every 20 people you see on the street have lost their ancestral homes, their family lands, their inheritance, all handed over to foreign lords who couldn't even speak their language. The scale of this wealth transfer was absolutely staggering, and the Domesday Book was the instrument that made it all official. But here's where our story takes a turn that shows the incredible courage of ordinary people facing impossible odds. Deep in the heart of this massive bureaucratic machine, there was a Saxon scribe named Ælfric, who was about to risk everything for his people. Ælfric had a skill that most Saxons didn't possess. He could read and write Latin fluently. This rare ability had saved him from the fate of so many of his countrymen, who'd been stripped of their positions after the conquest. Instead of losing everything, he'd been kept on by the Norman administration, because they desperately needed people who understood both Saxon customs and Norman legal requirements. For months, Ælfric had been faithfully copying the survey records, watching as village after village was catalogued and claimed by Norman lords. But as the work continued, something inside him began to break. He was seeing his own people, families he'd known since childhood, being systematically dispossessed of everything they'd ever owned. Picture Ælfric working late one evening in the monastery scriptorium, the only light coming from a single candle flickering beside his writing desk. Around him are stacks of parchment filled with the devastating details of Norman conquest. He picks up a fresh sheet and begins copying the survey of his home village, the place where he was born, where his parents were buried, where his childhood friends still struggled to survive under Norman rule. As he writes, Ælfric realizes something that makes his hand tremble. The numbers don't have to be exact. The Norman officials who had conducted the survey were long gone, moved on to other villages. The final records would be copied and filed away, probably never to be checked again. Who would know if certain details were adjusted? So Ælfric made a decision that would haunt the rest of his short life. He began making small changes to the records. A village recorded as having 50 families might be written down as having only 30. Land described as highly fertile might be recorded as poor and marshy. Tax assessments that would bankrupt entire communities were quietly reduced. Night after night, Ælfric worked his quiet rebellion. He wasn't just copying records anymore. He was trying to save lives. Every number he changed meant fewer taxes for desperate families. Every assessment he reduced meant children who wouldn't starve that winter. Here's what's heartbreaking about Ælfric's story. He knew exactly what would happen if he was caught. Medieval law was absolutely clear about falsifying royal documents. It was considered treason against the crown, and the punishment was designed to serve as a warning that would terrify anyone else who might consider similar resistance. For several months, Ælfric's secret rebellion worked perfectly. Villages that should have been crushed by impossible tax demands found themselves with manageable obligations. Families that should have been driven from their lands were able to stay. Ælfric had become a guardian angel that no one even knew existed. But medieval record-keeping was more thorough than Ælfric had realized. When Norman officials began cross-referencing the survey records with actual tax collections, discrepancies started appearing. Villages were paying less than the Domesday Book said they owed. Land values didn't match the assessments. The investigation that followed was swift and merciless. Norman administrators traced the inconsistencies back to the scriptorium where Ælfric worked. When they examined his handwriting against the suspicious entries, the evidence was undeniable. What happened to Ælfric serves as one of the most tragic examples of how the Norman conquest crushed not just rebellion, but simple human compassion. His punishment was designed to send a message that would echo across England. Even the smallest act of resistance would be met with consequences so severe that they would terrify anyone else who might consider defying Norman authority. The terrible irony is that Ælfric's fate was recorded in the very same careful detail as everything else in that meticulous Norman bureaucracy. His name, his crime, his punishment, all written down in the same precise handwriting that he had used to try to save his people. This is the real price of the Norman progress. Not just the displacement of an entire ruling class, but the crushing of anyone who dared show mercy in a system designed to show none. Here we stand at the end of our story, facing one of history's most profound moral puzzles. The Domesday Book undeniably brought order to a chaotic land, but at what cost? This is the question that has haunted historians for nearly 1,000 years, and it's one that still echoes in our world today. Picture England before the Domesday Survey, a patchwork of different laws, customs, and traditions that had grown organically over centuries. Saxon villages operated under customs their ancestors had followed for generations. Local disputes were settled according to traditions passed down through oral history. It was messy, sometimes unfair, but it was genuinely English in a way that would soon be lost forever. William's Great Survey changed all of this with ruthless efficiency. Imagine the transformation, where once there had been dozens of different ways of measuring land. Some villages used acres, others used different local measurements that had evolved over time. Now everything was standardized according to Norman methods. Where once disputes were settled by village elders who knew the local customs, now everything was decided according to Norman legal precedents. On paper, this looks like progress, and in many ways, it genuinely was. The Norman system was more organized, more predictable, more modern by medieval standards. Merchants could trade more easily when they knew that measurements and laws would be the same from village to village. Tax collection became systematic rather than haphazard. But here's what gets lost in discussions about administrative efficiency. Entire cultures began disappearing. Think about what happened to Saxon names during this period. Villages that had been called by Saxon names for centuries were suddenly renamed with Norman French equivalents. Families whose names had been passed down for generations found themselves recorded in the Domesday Book under Normanized versions that barely resembled their original identities. Picture a village that had been known as Ethelingstown, meaning the nobleman's settlement in Old English, suddenly becoming Adelinton, or eventually just Alton, as scribes struggled to fit Saxon sounds into Norman spelling conventions. Each of these changes might seem small, but multiply them across thousands of villages, and you're witnessing the systematic erasure of a culture's memory. The most heartbreaking part was how this affected ordinary families. Imagine being a Saxon farmer whose family had worked the same land for 5 generations. Your grandfather's name was Elfrid, your father's name was Ælfric, and your name was Ælfward, names that connected you to centuries of English tradition. But when the Domesday commissioners arrived, they recorded your family as Alfred, son of Alric, son of Edward, because Norman scribes couldn't be bothered to preserve the subtle differences in Saxon naming conventions. Within a generation, children were being given Norman names by parents who wanted them to succeed in the new world order. Saxon poetry, Saxon laws, Saxon ways of understanding the world. All of these began fading as people adapted to survive under Norman rule. Here's a detail that captures the strange tragedy of this transformation. Many of the monks who copied the Domesday Book records were themselves Saxon, men who had devoted their lives to preserving knowledge and culture. Yet here they were, participating in the systematic documentation of their own culture's disappearance. They wrote down the new Norman names for their own villages, recorded the Norman lords who now controlled the lands where they had grown up, all while knowing they were helping to erase the world of their childhood. Picture Brother Godwin, a Saxon monk working late into the night in his monastery scriptorium. By candlelight, he carefully copies the survey records for his home county, his quill moving across the parchment with practiced precision. As he writes, perhaps a tear falls, whether from the strain of working by dim light or from the weight of what he's recording, we'll never know. That single tear falling onto the parchment and causing the brown ink to blur slightly becomes a perfect symbol for this entire period. Here was a book that represented the pinnacle of medieval administrative achievement, a document so comprehensive and well-organized that it would serve as a model for government record-keeping for centuries to come. Yet it was also a book that documented the systematic replacement of one culture with another. The final image that stays with me is this. Picture the completed Domesday Book being closed for the last time by William's scribes. The massive leather binding shutting with a soft thud over nearly 2 million words of meticulous record-keeping. Inside those pages was everything that mattered to Norman administration. Every tax owed, every acre claimed, every strategic resource catalogued. But also trapped between those pages, like pressed flowers that would crumble if exposed to air, were the remnants of Saxon England. Names that would never again be spoken as they once were. Customs that would survive only in half-remembered fragments. A whole way of understanding the world that had been measured, recorded, and then quietly replaced. The Domesday Book stands as perhaps history's greatest example of how progress and loss can be the same thing, viewed from different angles. It brought efficiency, organization, and stability to a war-torn land. But it also represents one of the most complete cultural transformations ever documented, a reminder that every great leap forward leaves something precious behind. And that tear on the parchment, real or imagined, reminds us that behind every historical statistic, there were real people living through changes they never chose, adapting to survive in a world that was becoming unrecognizable with each passing day. Here's something that will absolutely amaze you. The Domesday Book has survived for over 900 years. Think about that for a moment. Empires have risen and fallen. Languages have evolved beyond recognition. Entire ways of life have disappeared. Yet this medieval survey still sits in the British National Archives, as readable today as it was when William's scribes first set down their quills. But the real power of the Domesday Book isn't in its age. It's in the lesson it teaches us about something that's just as relevant today as it was in 1086. When someone gains the power to write the official version of events, they don't just control what happened in the past, they shape what people believe is possible in the future. William understood something that rulers throughout history have grasped. Whoever controls the records controls the narrative. The Domesday Book wasn't just a survey. It was William's way of saying, this is how things are now, this is how they've always been, and this is how they'll always be. By writing down Norman ownership of English lands in such meticulous detail, he was making Norman rule seem not like a recent conquest, but like the natural order of things. Here's what's fascinating and a little unsettling when you really think about it. How many times in your own life have you accepted something as just the way things are, simply because it was written down somewhere official? How often do we assume that the way power is distributed today is somehow inevitable, just because we can find it documented in impressive-looking records? The people living through the Domesday Survey probably felt the same way we might feel if tomorrow someone showed up at our door with official documents completely reorganizing our entire society. They would have wondered, how did this happen? How did we go from the world we knew to this completely different reality? But here's the most powerful question that emerges from this entire story, and it's one that connects medieval England directly to our modern world. If you had lived through the creation of the Domesday Book, where would your name have appeared? Would you have been one of the Norman lords, benefiting from the new system? Would you have been a Saxon farmer watching your ancestral lands being recorded under someone else's name? Would you have been brave like Aelfric, risking everything to help others? Or would you have been like Richard de Clare, torn between your conscience and your loyalty? More importantly, in today's world, when new Domesday Books are being written all the time, whether they're databases tracking our digital lives, economic systems determining who prospers and who struggles, or social media algorithms shaping what information we see, which side of history are we on? The Domesday Book reminds us that the records we create today will be tomorrow's history. The systems we accept, the inequalities we tolerate, the voices we choose to preserve or ignore, all of these become the official version that future generations will inherit. And just like those Saxon villagers who watch their names being written in Norman records, we might not even realize we're participating in the creation of tomorrow's reality. William's Great Survey teaches us that power isn't just about armies and castles. Sometimes the most lasting power comes from simply being the person holding the pen when the final version of events gets written down. And that's a lesson that echoes across 9 centuries, as relevant in our digital age as it was in the candlelit scriptoriums of Norman England. The question that should keep us awake at night is this: when future historians look back at our time, whose version of events will they find in the archives? And will we be proud of the world we documented into existence? If you've enjoyed uncovering these hidden layers of medieval history with me, I'd love to continue this journey together. Hit that like button if this story made you see the past, and maybe the present, in a new light. Share this video with anyone who loves discovering the human stories behind the history books. And make sure to subscribe to the Medieval Archives, because there are so many more incredible tales from the Middle Ages that your history teachers never had time to tell you. Trust me, once you start seeing medieval history as the collection of amazing human stories it really is, you'll never look at the past the same way again.